All right, welcome to closed ecological systems, the biotic interactions part. This is just going to be part one of the notes on biotic interactions in closed ecological systems. Here's the targets. They're in your notes and in the handout. You can check those out whenever you're ready. Now, the types of biotic interactions we're going to look at are predator-prey, competition, symbiosis. That exact definition is not really that clear, so we're going to talk about a couple different ones as well as mimicry. Now, just a preview, you can do these in your notes. We're not going to do them right now, but what you're going to look at is whether or not you think the things in each of these categories are benefited or harmed. For parasitism, you might already be aware, right? One organism, which is we'd think of as the parasite, is benefited. We're going to put in this case, just to give an example, a plus sign, which means it appreciates it or benefits from it. And then the second organism, that would be the host, would be hurt by that interaction. So just a preview, go through and fill out the rest, as well as any key terms you can think about in the right hand side there. And we'll come back to that and double check that later. So the first type of biotic interaction you're fairly familiar with already. It's called predator-prey. That's when a predator hunts, kills, and consumes another organism known as the prey. Some of those you're familiar with, like the example here, or maybe you're not familiar with this example, giant water bug hunting down a minnow in your CES, or a lion hunting down a gazelle, that sort of thing. But the other thing to think of is that the Daphnia, the water fleas you put in there, are eating algae in your environment. So they're a predator and the algae is prey, just like deer are a predator to grass or plants in our ecosystem. Now, when two organisms try and use the same resource, we call that competition. There's two different things to fill out here. One is intra-specific competition. Notice the TRA is the important part there. That means between the same species. So if these two water striders are the same species, then they would be competing for resources. They're actually predators, and they hunt for things floating downstream and in a stream or in a pond. That's an example of intraspecific competition, and the other version is interspecific. So even the plants in there compete very aggressively towards each other, competing for light and competing for nutrients in the water as well as carbon dioxide. So the duckweed here and the filamentous algae are also competitors. And you have to understand that all resources, space, food, water, mates, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, they're all limited resources. So there's always going to be competition in an environment. Now, there's two different parts of your environment. One is the habitat. The habitat is the physical location. So for your ecosystem, the habitat is the bottle. It might be McLaughlin Run Stream or the pond that I got the pond water out of, any of those. The second part is the niche or the job in the environment the organism has. So for instance, in that pond water, you could have a dragonfly nymph and a water flea, which are both in the same habitat of your bottle or the pond water, but their niche or organism job in the environment is different. The dragonfly is a predator and the water flea is an herbivore, and so they'd be operating at two very different levels, doing two very different things in your ecosystem. Now, just a little background of rats and what happens. The food goes into the rat's mouth, excuse me. It goes down the esophagus and into the stomach, and from the stomach, which is pretty acidic and a tough place to live, it then empties into this part here called the small intestine. The small intestine is actually a great place for living things, because what happens is that the small intestine's pH gets buffered back to closer to 7, so it's a pretty good environment, and the food is all digested but has not been absorbed yet. So if you're a parasite, the best place to live is in this upper part of the intestine that I'm highlighting right here, because there's the greatest amount of food there. As you get further down into the intestine and into the large intestine, the nutrients have been absorbed by the rat's own intestines, and there's a lot less food. So the best environment, if you are a parasite, is going to be in this environment right past the stomach in the small intestine. Okay, so in the mouth, through the intestines, and then that little area right there is a good place before it goes back down into the large intestine, where the nutrients have a lot less. Okay, so stomach's too acidic, large intestines, low quality nutrients, the small intestines, kind of like Goldilocks, just right. So there's two different niches that we talk about. The first one's the fundamental niche. That is the total number of resources or places that can be exploited by organisms. The second version is the realized niche. That's the resources used when there's competition involved. So for instance, these two worms, this is a spiny-headed worm and this is a tapeworm. Both of these worms would prefer in the gut of the rat, they would prefer to be right after the stomach, when all the contents of the stomach dump out the highest number of nutrients, plus the intestines pH is more comfortable for them. So if they're individual, then the spiny-headed worm and the tapeworm will both be in that same area. But if you find them together, if a rat gets infected with both a spiny-headed worm and a tapeworm, then what happens is the spiny-headed worm wins this battle and displaces the tapeworm further down. So the fundamental niche is the entire gut of the rat, but the realized niche, where it ends up with competition, will depend on who is there previously, right? If there are spiny-headed worms, they nudge under the tapeworms and dislodge them, and the tapeworms grab on further down in an area that's not necessarily as beneficial as far as the food content there. Now, how can you test who wins and when they win? The experiments were done by a guy by the name of Gauss, and Gauss looked at two different paramecium species, which are shown in the pictures here. Each one was grown separately with a food source. That means they were in different containers. These are pond critters that you would see if you looked under a microscope. And then what he did is he put them together in the same container. And then for you might look and say, wow, they just look like a couple of, things or blobs that would be in the pond. But because they're two different species, you need to think of these things as like one is a blue jay and one might be a robin, right? That's how different they are genetically and how different they are as far as their species. So although blue jays and robins often overlap in their food source, they're two very different species. Now it's tough to test who wins between blue jays and robins because their niches are not direct. So that's why that's why Gauss worked with these two paramecium species in separate containers and then put them together in a common container. So here's the graphs that show them. The two paramecium names are not that important, but it's Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia. Here is one of the paramecium species. So what he did was this, on the y-axis here is the population numbers essentially, and the x-axis is basically the time period for both of these graphs. So notice Paramecium caudatum, or one of the paramecium, if you put food in and you kept putting in food and removing waste products, they grow in population, and then they essentially reach a carrying capacity where they can't grow any faster because there's not enough food and not enough space. If you put Aurelia in its own environment, Paramecium species B here, once again they do great in there. But what happens is he then found that if you put the two of them together, notice what happens is that Paramecium aurelia keeps doing well, but caudatum disappeared. Even though the food was the same, the water was the same, what happens is one eliminates the other. And so that's called the competitive exclusion principle, was derived from this, which says anytime two species are occupying the same niche or doing the same job in the same environment at the same time, one of them will eliminate the other. This only basically works within limited areas and with very controlled conditions, like, for instance, in this case, glass beaker sort of environments. So what happens is often if you change things around, you can get different results. Now, in reality, the competitive exclusion principle gets basically as a kind of a point to think about why it is things are different. So if you look at these two birds here, one of them, the owl, and the other one, the hawk, they basically both eat the same food source, right? Small rodents, snakes, things like that. But so their niches essentially overlap. And so the competitive exclusion principle would say they cannot exist both in the same environment at the same time. But they've split up the niche in a way that these guys hunt during the day. It's called a diurnal hunter or a daytime hunter, and these guys are nocturnal hunters. So in a controlled environment like a petri dish, you can control and limit how things can operate. But in nature, what happens is things find a way around that competition and end up being able to both exist in their slightly different varieties of that niche, however. And an extreme example of this was found in pine trees in New Jersey. So this is the kind of pine tree example here. There were 5 different birds they found, 5 different warblers that all were living in the same trees. And so the idea was that these are a violation of the competitive exclusion principle because they are all living in the same pine trees. But it turns out they're not identical, that they all hunt in different parts of the tree and nest in different parts. So this is called resource partitioning. This is essentially like splitting up the ecosystem or the niche into many different parts so that all of the organisms can live. Now they would overlap in certain areas and there'd be competition in those areas, but essentially where there's not competition is where the individual species could thrive. So that's called resource partitioning, which is splitting up a niche rather than 2 ways, splitting it 5 ways. Now plants, although we often think of animals competing, plants actually compete aggressively. They compete for light, for nutrients and water. We'll learn later in the year how they also work together and interact with other animals in their ecosystem. But for now we're just going to talk about their competition. And so we talked in one of the scavenger hunts about allelopathy. That's when plants in their roots normally and sometimes in their seeds. This here is called poison hemlock, and what happens is that poison hemlock will in its seeds that it's producing here produces a toxin, and that toxin gets into the ground and it basically prevents other plant species from growing near it. And so that's what's kind of being shown down here. Black walnut does that, a number of other trees and other plants do that to limit plants, other competitors from being in that area and taking their nutrients, especially when their seeds are going to be dropped locally. They can prevent other species from being in there, but not prevent their own offspring from being in that area. Now, one defense against predators is camouflage. Camouflage is just mimicking parts of the environment. It also can be used as a hunting strategy. So this water bug here will be found in pond ecosystems. It looks like a leaf structure. So in one case, that's camouflage because it looks like a leaf, so therefore it doesn't get attacked by fish trying to eat there. And then also, however, this is an ambush predator, which means it looks like a leaf, and therefore when things go near it, it doesn't look dangerous until they get too close. If you want to see the video of that, you can click on to the notes, the PDF of the notes on Canvas, or you can type in this YouTube plugin and watch that to see that video. Now, there's also chemical defense. The most kind of common you might be familiar with is skunks. They're toxic chemicals. Sometimes they are internal, which means they're in the organism. Think of like a puffer fish and the toxic chemicals in there, or it could be external, for instance, the skunk that sprays them. Plants also do this. They're called secondary metabolites, secondary plant compounds or metabolites, or also called allelochemicals. They're secondary metabolites because primary metabolites would be the metabolites that are used to actually grow and reproduce and do the normal plant growth requirements like repair and growth and development. These chemicals aren't part of that. They're just part of defense. So for instance, the taste of the heat of hot peppers, which is from a chemical called capsaicin, nicotine, which is found in tobacco plants, and obviously in cigarettes, is actually a defense against insects eating the plant. And then obviously it has a different effect on mammals. Poison ivy is an example, right, of keeping things away from it. And then another one is caffeine. Caffeine in high doses is also meant to deter insects from eating plants, and obviously a different effect on humans, which is the effect of coffee. Now, another defense against predators is mimicry, and if you want to see an extreme example of this, you can watch this mimic octopus that is in this video here, and you can click on that from the notes PDF or type this into any of the browsers. All right, I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to make that the first part.